Next, we'd like to walk you through some of the Unison features that are under the global setting. And when we got together a few days ago to walk through the synth, I found some really cool parameters in here. So let's jump right in and show the people what's up.
Great. Yeah, so we'll take a quick step back. We remember over here we were showing the Unison settings that you activate here. So in order to hear any of these settings, we're going to need to first have Unison enabled. So I'm going to turn the Unison up to, say, 7. And so we're getting those 7 copies with a certain amount of detune. I think we briefly mentioned before that this first one sets the range. So if you wanted to have a really wide pitch range on your detune, that's how you do it here, is with this one in the top. I'm using this left control because this is oscillator A, and over here on the right is for oscillator B.
And those are semitones, right?
That's right. This is a number of semitones that represents the most extreme range if detune was set to maximum.
Cool.
How far apart are those outer voices? So typical use, if you want something to sound musical, would be in the sort of the 2 semitone range, kind of at max. And anything past there, it starts sounding really like a cluster of separate notes.
Dissonance.
Yes, exactly. And that can be cool in its own right. So typical, the default is 2, and that's going to be for typical use, is fine. Moving on below the range, we see this width control. And this is one that's actually pretty popular and pretty used, despite the fact that all this is doing is taking the panning that is built into these by default and collapsing it away. So now all of our voices, if this is set to 0, are all panned center. So we're just determining how much stereo panning is in this.
Is 100% left? And I mean, is it all the way left and all the way right at 100?
It is for the outermost voices. So the way that the voices are stacked in the Unisons, they're spread across the stereo panorama field.
Nice.
And so you have one voice on each side that's going to be extreme panned, and then they kind of move inward from there.
Great. Just the same way that it's visually represented in the oscillator screen.
That's right. The same way that the detune works for tuning, the panning is working the same way with this width control. It's just maximum by default.
Cool.
So most panned, and then all collapsed together. The reason people really like this is because they like the mono width for a couple of reasons. One reason is that's the way that like the default classic hypersaw in the Roland world and all that was done, was just a mono output. So these 7 voices or whatever are all stacked together mono. And there's another advantage to this is that you get this phase cancellation happening between the voices, because when they're spread, they've got their own space in the field and they don't really phase cancel, especially if they're panned hard wide.
They're coming out of separate speakers, so it's...
Right, so there's no interaction or cancellation going on. But when you have them panned, collapsed together so there's no panning, they start to really cancel against each other. So that's popular in the world for like making these Reese sounds, where you can say maybe set your Unison to 2.
Hey, while we're talking about this, can we pull up a patch and play it as we're adjusting the voices in the Unison so people can hear it?
Yeah, great. So you can hear the stereo spread there, and when it's together, you hear this phasiness up here. And so that can be kind of useful for getting this sort of Reese sound, especially if we now run this through distortion or some multiband compressor and start emphasizing that kind of motion that's going on with those.
I like it.
The next setting here in the advanced Unison settings is this warp option. And so what the warp option allows us to do is have a different warp depth for all of these Unison voices that are firing. So as we've hit this one note and have these multiple copies of the oscillator happening, we can actually have them all impart their slightly unique tone for each one of them. And this allows the sound to just be more overall rich. So an example of that, I'll just use, say, sync, because it's a very noticeable example. So I'll use sync here. And you can see by default, I'd have this whatever certain sync amount. And let me put the Unison to 1 for a second, and you'll hear that very noticeable sound, how it feels like it's changing format or changing pitch in a way. Right? And so now if we add in the Unison, you can hear they all have that same format being applied to all of them. We just have some detuning is the only way that we hear that there's more than one. If I were to enable this warp, we'll start hearing a slightly different amount, or as I raise it, more drastic different amount of warp for each voice. You can hear now some kind of moved down and some kind of moved up in the amount of format. If I spread it out back to stereo, you can really noticeably hear how the left speaker and the right speaker.
Yeah, you can tell there's a lot going on across the stereo field.
Yeah, and it's a different sound on the left and the right now. So we've added this width in a way that you wouldn't be able to do with just detuning. We've really sort of made this sound that is different on both speakers, in a sort of unique way. So, by the way, all of these can be automated. So if we wanted to automate this warp control of the Unison, we can drag a mod source right to it.
Nice.
And now we've got the LFO controlling this width.
Very cool.
So that is that, and of course it'll work for any of these features, including FM depth or anything like that. We can have it slightly different for each voice.
Nice.
Similarly to that feature is the next one here, which after warp is the WT pause. So it's really the same concept, but instead of deviating the warp amount for every voice, we're deviating the wavetable position. So we're able to get an actual different wavetable for every single one of these Unison voices. And again, the result is kind of similar, which is that we get a sound which has a slightly different character across the spectrum.
We're playing different frames within that wavetable.
We're playing different frames within the wavetable simultaneously. And it can be kind of neat because you end up with sometimes this 3D effect. I mean, if you look at this waveform that we have here, we can see how these waveforms all kind of correlate together. And now when we stack a bunch of voices, this means now we're going to have 5 different ones of these playing with the width at 100%. Now we have 5 different positions, right, with a slightly different waveform happening. And I've had moments where I really felt like I almost could see or touch this waveform because you can feel how it has this sort of stereo existence to it. So it's a really neat feature. And if you really want to sense it the most, you can take your detune almost down to 0. I mean, it makes the voices kind of collapse, but it makes it so that it's not constantly moving with this detune. So maybe just a little detune. And sometimes you get these really neat kind of 3D effects happening with the sound that's neither, you know.
Right, very cool.
So that's a lot of fun. Equally neat is this stack feature, which is the next one.
One of my favorites.
Yeah. The stack feature is not at all related to these other ones in the sense that it's not, it's not changing the waveform per voice, but we're rather changing the tuning per voice in a way more similar to the detune, in the sense that the detune is having a different pitch for every voice. It's the same idea as that, but the detune you could think of as more sort of like a fine tuning for every voice, whereas the stack is these preset fixed values like octave. So this is a way that you can sort of stack up your keyboard in a sense and play one note and have multiple octaves all happen. Even with detune at 0, we can use stack and now get multiple octaves happening on a single key press.
Very cool.
And so these 12 plus 7 are adding in those perfect fifths. And then we can have these other ones that say center if you keep dragging up this list. And so center minus 12 means that these central oscillators, in other words, the ones that are yellow here in this blend, in this case it's just this one, would be dropped an octave.
Oh, okay.
So otherwise we have all the same pitch except one is dropped an octave in the middle of our field, which is nice to get that extra sort of fat sound in a sense. You can hear that versus without it.
And obviously mine is 24, it's going down 2 octaves, so.
Right, we have to even turn up to hear that on these speakers.
Nice.
So those are useful for getting a thicker sound out, and that's the stack feature. And the last one, which also is layered as stack, and was kind of an oversight there, which I'll be fixing, is the detune mode, right? So this is the way, I think that's what it says when we hover over it. Yes, Unison detune mode. So the detune mode is choosing how the detune knob is spreading these voices. So you can see right now they all look equidistant. In other words, the spacing between them is the same. So they're spread across this pitch tuning deviation is equal between every single voice.
Which is a linear setting.
It's the linear setting. They're linearly spaced. Exponential would mean that they sort of increase for every additional pair of voices that we're adding. The distance of the amount of detuning is increasing exponentially. So you can see here now when I move this detune knob, that's represented visually. Let me raise the value up there so you can really see it, right? So the inner voices there are closer together, and you can see they get further and further apart as we go outside of that.
Nice.
And that gives you sort of a natural effect if you think of a string section playing. So the players are more likely to be in tune, right? So there's going to be more people close to the correct pitch, and then gradually we have a few people that are a little lazy and a little more out of tune. Right. But rather than being linearly spaced, which is a little less realistic. So it's useful for that, for a slightly more realistic kind of detune. And then I have super, which I made, and super is sort of an in-between. It's neither exponential nor linear. It's sort of half exponential. And so you can see that is sort of halfway spaced right there. And I find that one sort of just musically useful. It's just, to my ears, was satisfying, so I allowed that to be a setting and named it super. Inverse is kind of a wacky one. Inverse is an inverted exponential. So we have, you can see some density going on the extreme edges there. And so that can be nice for sort of really spooky kind of horror kind of things where you want it to feel like there's two pitch centers and that they're kind of like, especially if you're automating this detune, so it could start together and then you move it out. It would be almost like as if you had two pitches and pitch bend them away from each other. So it can be kind of nice for that kind of a...
I don't know why Knife Party comes to mind when you were describing that.
Probably spooky. No, I don't know. The last one would be the random, right? So random is going to be different every time I play a note. So you can see that represented there, where it really just moves these unison voices around randomly in the field. Be most noticeable if we have a lot of detune in a couple voices. Obviously, if I crank up this range, we'll really hear it. So the random might just be nice for times where you want things to be subtly different every single time the note plays. You might have a riff that does a lot of stuff that's the same, and you might feel like, oh, just a little bit of random detune for the voices could be cool. So it's an option. So there you have it. The last thing to mention is, as I mentioned previously, this right side is the same thing duplicated for oscillator B, and that you can adjust both simultaneously. If you're using both oscillators and you want them to be the same, you can use these arrows I added in the middle.
Nice. I was wondering what those did.
Yeah, it's just a handy way to be able to control, keep both the same. That's what those are for. And you can similarly reset on them. And there you have it. That's the advanced unison.
Well done, Steve.
Thank you.